With the NHL having 32 teams for the last few seasons, there's early conjecture that as many as four more could be on the way in the not too distant future. We're going to talk all about it on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday afternoon edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, where now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, on today's show, we are going to be discussing the merits of NHL expansion. And I, for one, am a bit befuddled. So our first segment, we're just going to talk about the economics of the NHL, where the NHL as a league, its money comes from, how revenues are generated, where there are opportunities for revenue growth. Our second segment, we're going to talk about the mechanics of expansion itself based on the Seattle and Vegas experiences. And then our final segment, we're going to talk about why I don't think it would be a good thing for the quality of the game to add as many as four, if not at least two more expansion teams in the not so distant future. So you have heard me talk a lot on this show about the idea that the NHL, is a big pie. There are 32 pieces in that pie right now, the way revenues are divided, because revenues, at least at the league-wide level, for things like the national TV deals, merchandise, and national sponsors, that money all goes into one pot and it's divided 32 ways. When we talk about revenue, the NHL is an extreme outlier in North America when it comes to where their money comes from. So I'm going to click over to my notes here because I want to get these numbers correctly. So, the last year's the data is available for. The NFL did $18.7 billion in revenue. The NBA and MLB both did $10.9 billion. And the NHL did $6 billion in comparison to the other big three North American sports leagues. The biggest part of the pie for the National Hockey League, 44% of NHL revenues are from gate sales, meaning tickets and people going to the physical games. Next up is central revenue, which is national sponsorships, their national TV deals. So down here in the States, that would be TNT and ESPN. Up in Canada, Sportsnet, TSN, etc. Things like merchandise, Fanatics, their big deal. Sponsorships on a national level. Local media, so your individual team's TV deal here in the New York metro area, that would be MSG Network. In other regions, it might be Bally Sports, it might be Fox Sports, what have you. And then the final part of the pie, 12%, is concessions, parking, on-site merchandise sales. And in comparison, and this is what I keep emphasizing to people, 66% of the NFL's revenue is their TV deal. 41% of the NBA's revenue is their TV deals. Because of the way the NHL revenue world is structured, that's why this expansion is even a subject of conversation. There is no need for more teams. We are already reaching a point where the regular season is largely pointless because of how many mediocre or outright bad teams there are. But we're going to talk about that in our third segment, so I don't want to jump ahead. But when we talk about revenues and we talk about finding ways to make the league more money, the most obvious way is trying to grow the potential TV revenue. How do you get people to care about your sport? You have got to aggressively target them marketing-wise on social media and through free mediums, ways you can get your content in front of them that aren't going to cost you a lot of money so that there is more demand to watch games on TV, because that is the most profitable and most direct way to exponentially grow your revenues. The NHL TV deal here in North America now, and I should say in the United States, is a lot better than the deal they had under NBC, which was 10 years, and that expired right before the 2021-2022 season. That was the first season where games were on ESPN and TNT, if I remember correctly. It might have been 2021, but I'm pretty sure it was the year after that. So TV revenues are tricky. And I do want to talk about this, A, because I find it interesting, and B, because I don't think we have the right we don't talk about the right reasons the NHL isn't growing. TV revenues are a speculative venture for the television networks. You know, for ESPN to write the NHL a check for however many hundreds of millions of dollars for a given year, that is based on the idea that there are going to be enough people who want to watch the games that ESPN is going to be able to sell commercial time during the games, before the games, during the pregame, during the postgame, that they are going to be able to make some money back on that they are going to be able to make a profit off of doing that. And TV rights for sports, I should clarify, for live sports, are one of the last few genuine ventures for cable and network televisions that can make them money. You know, most of the TV shows that are out there now on CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, etc., they are not very profitable ventures. Media as a whole right now is very fractured, it's very segmented, and it creates this space where it's really hard to project where we're going. You see, the TV rights have driven a lot of the way we talk about sports in the last 15 to 20 years because of the proliferation of streaming service and the ease of access. Now, you are looking at the possibility where the NHL is going to be playing games on ESPN/ABC in the United States, TNT, True TV. There will be playoff games on True TV. Your local networks, you have streaming exclusive. You have ESPN Plus/Hulu exclusives where you need that subscription service. In Canada, you need Sportsnet, you need TSN. Amazon is getting exclusive games in Canada, which is something that I think is probably on the horizon here in the United States, as more games going to exclusive platforms. So the league can get more money up front. And that gets to the core of this expansion conversation for me, is the NHL does not want to do the legwork of growing the game to make more revenue the old-fashioned way, if you will. The TV rights, the merchandise, the genuine appetite, the excitement for it. And instead, by looking at expansion as a means of growing revenues, it's a sugar high. It is a one-time fix. You know, you'll get that expansion fee and it'll get distributed out however many ways, depending on how they treat Vegas and Seattle. And those owners will all get an even split of that expansion money. And the thing that's really messed up about this, the players are not entitled to a part of that. Expansion fees do not go into hockey-related revenue, which is how the distribution of salaries goes out. You know, we talked about this a few weeks ago, the way, why can't I think of the word? The way escrow works, where because the revenues need to be 50-50, the players put money aside every year, and that makes up the difference at the end of the year if the players end up making more of the total revenue, because the salary cap is calculated off of projections a year ahead, and they can't know how the revenues are going to go until the end of the year. And that's largely because 44% of hockey revenues are driven by gate and ticket sales, which is variance. You know, there are teams who are going to stink, who are only going to sell 7,000 or 8,000 tickets a game, and that's going to cut into the overall league's revenue, and that's part of why you're going to end up having players having to pay back the owner. So we are going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we will tackle the Seattle and Vegas expansion rules, the way the money was paid out, and why those are I don't want to say outlier, but those are short-term solutions to a more big picture problem. So stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. And if you're like me, you are desperately trying to stave off the oncoming fall. I got to the Met game last night with one of my friends I hadn't seen in quite a while. We had a great time. The Mets won big against the Phillies. Crucial game if the Mets are going to make the playoffs. And I got our tickets through the Game Time app with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience. Things like, you've heard me talk about this incessantly, we got great seats last night in the lower bowl left field corner because I was able to use the seat view. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference in Game Time ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Thanks to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are tackling another round of potential NHL expansion. So I tweeted about this yesterday, and I have gotten a disgusting amount of replies. I've muted notifications for the tweet because I have had so many people reply either, yes, I agree, or no, you're a dumbass. And it's unfortunate because I think this is an important topic that tells you a lot about the state of the NHL. The NHL owners all recognize that they're the smallest of the big four North American leagues, and that includes Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, National Basketball Association, National Football League. The NHL is still ahead of MLS here in North America, but the one caveat I will say, more people watch the Barclays Premier League on the NBC family of networks here in the United States than people watch the NHL in the United States. Canada, of course, is a little bit different, but I do want to emphasize that hockey is not growing nearly at the rate as the other sports, and there are a lot of factors that go into this. This isn't just greed. This isn't just on the grassroots level. It's expensive to play. Everything is interconnected. You've heard me talk about this a lot on the show over the last few months I've been doing it. Things happen for short, medium, and long-term reasons. There are long-term factors that got us here from 15, 20 years ago that got the NHL to the point we're at right now, where it's in a weird state where the revenues are growing year over year, but they are not growing at the rate of the other professional sports leagues. And the NHL owners notice that. The NHL owners are looking around and saying, how come we aren't making as much money as those guys? And one of the quick solutions to that problem is getting a lump sum check for $20-30 million from another rich guy who wants to have a brand new team come into existence. And look, I understand from the NHL's perspective, and Bill Daly talked about this a few weeks ago, that technically speaking, because the NHL has 7 teams in Canada and 25 down in the States, we have more room to grow in the United States, that there are markets we would like to explore, whether that be Houston, whether that be Atlanta, maybe another team somewhere I'm not thinking of, maybe in the Midwest. But the problem I have with this solution is it is a temporary fix. It is not mitigating the external factors that is creating this environment. You are not doing enough to grow the game at large. You are not doing enough to get people invested in your sport because you are so focused on short-term profits. That's why I always say the key to growth is growing the overall pie, not cutting up the pie more. It's the exact same proposition as a pizza party in kindergarten where they cut the slices in half so every pie has 16 slices as opposed to 8. Like, yeah, you had 2 slices, but you really only had 1. That's what the NHL is doing here if we're actually considering another round of expansion. And the reason I say 36 as opposed to 34, you can't have 17 teams in each conference because of the way you're going to do it. The other problem I have, and you know what? No, I'll save that for the third segment because that's more that lane. So the last 2 rounds of NHL expansion, we had Vegas, we have Seattle. Vegas, $500 million buy-in to get in the league. That revenue, that $500 million was divided 30 ways. The other 30 owners all got a check for $500 million divided by 30. Seattle, a few years later, $650 million divided by 30 ways. If I remember correctly, Vegas was not entitled to that cut of the Seattle expansion fee because Vegas was exempt from the expansion draft. If I remember correctly, I might be misremembering. The problem with using expansion fees as a means of growing revenue is that it is a one-time payment. The other problem that no one seems to want to address is the fact that it is hard to get people to go to games. No matter how good your team is, no matter how bad your team is, it is hard to get people to go to games in most markets. There are some that will be timeless. Montreal, New York, Boston, Toronto, Chicago, kind of, but they were really bad before Bedard got there and their attendance took a real nosedive. But for the most part, most of your 32 markets that we currently have in the NHL are, I'm going to say, quality of team based, where if the team is mediocre or bad, they are not going to draw well. And that is going to hurt your bottom line. And you're going to say, well, Nick, if we have two more teams, those teams, but you got to remember, their local TV deals do not go to the other teams. Their gate does not go to the other teams. Their national TV rights are going to be split a little bit more. If anything, I think there's a real argument that you add two new teams, especially in the markets they're considering, you're going to end up having to pay out revenue shares to those smaller market teams. And that's something the NHL does for a competitive reason, to try and give small market teams, their owners, more money to play with so they can reinvest it in the team. The problem with that is, and we see this especially egregiously in baseball, that revenue doesn't get reinvested in the team. You see this a lot. And I understand the NHL salary cap is a lot lower than the other leagues. So teams look like they're spending a lot in comparison to the rest of their league. But when you think about how little some of these teams are putting into their resources, their infrastructure, their support staff, why are the other teams funding other owners being cheap? That seems counterintuitive. That seems bad. If anything, I would like to see teams put more effort into the things that aren't cap spending. I talk about this incessantly. There is no salary cap on support staff. There is no salary cap on facilities. There is no support staff on travel. Put these players in great accommodations. Give them world-class equipment and amenities to get prepared for their season, for rehab. Give them the access to the best training staff possible and reinvest your money back in the team, because ultimately that is going to lead to a greater result in profit down the road than just adding another team. And it frustrates me to no end, because this is not a meaningful solution. This is a short-term fix. This is not going to solve the NHL's overall growth problems. Get money in the system. You gotta grow the overall pie. You can't be all fighting over the same amount of money, because you're going to get smaller pieces. Yeah, great. You're going to get $25 million one time. Would you rather $25 million one time, or we can do $40 million extra annually because our next TV deal is more? And look, I understand all of this is kind of faulty under an infinite growth proposition, that the rights are always going to be worth more the next time a TV deal comes up, because revenues are going to keep growing from advertising because of inflation. Look, I understand there are macroeconomic trends that have nothing to do with professional hockey, but there is an avenue here for the National Hockey League to grow and do it without spending a lot of money, by just investing in the game, getting their players on TV, getting their games in favorable placements, getting their players in non-hockey settings. Go back to the Olympics, do the Four Nations face-off. Go out of your way, get these guys on talk shows, get them on podcasts, get them outside of the hockey bubble. Hockey is so insular, and it creates a great community, but people outside of the community don't always feel welcomed, and it's harder for them to break in when it feels so exclusive, when it doesn't feel like it's the most welcoming space. We're going to take one more quick break, and we're going to talk about why, from a hockey on ice perspective, another round of expansion would be bad for the NHL. So be sure to stick around. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you now. Through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then, with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon at a market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. This weekend, the Giants, the maligned Daniel Jones, going to Cleveland to take on the Browns, 6.5-point underdogs. Sneaky fun game. The Texans going up to Minnesota as a road favorite, 2.5 points against the Vikings. The game I'm most excited for this weekend, though, the Detroit Lions going to Arizona to take on Kyler Murray, Marvin Harrison Jr. The Lions, 3-point road favorites. That seems a little rich. I might be getting in on Kyler Murray and the Cardinals this weekend. And if you want to get in on the action, sprinkle a little bit more fun into the mix of your football Sunday, visit FanDuel.com, download America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we wrap up the week talking about NHL expansion, if it should happen, when it could happen. And look, I make no bones about saying I think 32 teams is too many in the NHL. I understand we are not in an economic climate that teams are going to just be contracted out of existence. They're going to be relocated, they're going to be sold, and the NHL is going to do everything in its power to maintain the footholds it has in the existing markets it's in. You saw how hard Gary Bettman and Bill Daley dragged their feet about getting the Coyotes out of Arizona, even though their owner was very clearly somebody who wasn't serious about the hockey team. But from an on-ice quality of play perspective, let me be clear. Yes, if you look around the world, there are absolutely 40 more guys who could play in the NHL. There are 40 guys who are just in the American Hockey League who could fill out bottom sixes in other places. My problem, and the reason I am very against another round of expansion, especially this early, is that the NHL does not have parity. The NHL has mediocrity. We have 32 teams in our league right now. There are at least 10 teams going into this upcoming NHL season that have zero chance of winning the Stanley Cup. Let's go through, shall we? The Montreal Canadiens will not be winning the Stanley Cup. The Chicago Blackhawks will not be winning the Stanley Cup. The San Jose Sharks will not be winning the Stanley Cup. The Anaheim Ducks will not be winning the Stanley Cup. The Columbus Blue Jackets will not be winning the Stanley Cup. The Philadelphia Flyers will not be winning the Stanley Cup. The Ottawa Senators, Buffalo Sabres, Detroit Red Wings will not be winning the Stanley Cup. I could even start going into teams that are reasonably playoff teams, like Pittsburgh, Washington, the Islanders. I would even dare say maybe the Hurricanes, the Utah Hockey Club, the Minnesota Wild, the St. Louis Blues. We're well over 10. We're almost at 16 out of 32. The other problem we have, and the reason I can't get my head around this, you are making the product worse. Somebody who pays for season tickets for the Oilers is spending a lot of money to get those tickets. If it's a 5-game plan, a 10-game plan, a 16-game plan, a 21, even God bless you, a 41-game plan. That is an absurd amount of money. And you're going to tell me if that person wants to resell their tickets, they're not even going to be able to get face value back because the Oilers are playing the Houston whatevers. We're playing the Houston Rockets tonight. Come spend $57 on this ticket to see Colin White play on a first line. Like, I don't want to be discounting the success that Vegas has been able to have, but it took extraordinary miscalculations in the expansion draft for Vegas to be as good as they were out of the gate. Vegas was so good out of the gate that everybody overreacted and messed up the Seattle expansion draft where nobody wanted to do any side trades. Nobody trusted Seattle because they didn't want to get one pulled over on them. So I understand it from that perspective. I am a supporter of the Southern Hockey Project. I have talked about it a lot, that Tampa Bay winning multiple Stanley Cups, Florida winning a Stanley Cup, Carolina winning a Stanley Cup in 2005, the Predators making a Stanley Cup, the Stars have won a Stanley Cup. You know, when you start talking about all of the successes, you can add Vegas in there. All of those teams in non-traditional markets, the Blues, St. Louis isn't a hockey market, but the NHL has made strides in those markets. I am telling you, there are not enough good players to support good teams. There are already too many teams that are just hanging around. I want to read these three stats for you. So, number one, the Washington Capitals made the playoffs last year as arguably the worst team to ever make the playoffs in this format since we've gone to the divisional alignment. In the last 14 years, they finished the regular season with a minus 37 goal differential. You're telling me we need more teams from mediocre teams like the Capitals to beat up on? And then number two, the regular season already is too diluted. We already have too many games for too many teams. Last year on American Thanksgiving, I wrote this down, November 24th of last year, 7 of the 8 teams that ended up in a playoff spot at the end of the regular season were already in playoff spots. The only team that wasn't in a spot that finished in one was the Islanders, and they passed the Flyers. In the Western Conference, 6 of 8 teams that were in playoff spots on American Thanksgiving finished in a playoff spot. The teams that weren't, the Oilers, who were digging themselves out of that really terrible start, and the Nashville Predators, who went on a 15-game winning streak in February to get themselves back in the mix. We do not need more bad teams for those mediocre teams to beat up on. Look, I understand the other side of it, that this is 40 to 50 more NHL players who are going to get to live the dream. That is a good thing. In theory, this is going to create new hockey fans. That is a good thing. In theory, this is going to make the gap between good teams and great teams and mediocre teams even bigger. Because if there are 40 more guys who weren't in the NHL last season, that should make the average quality of player go down a smidge, because if those guys weren't good enough to be in the NHL when there were 32 teams, how are they good enough to be in the NHL when they're 34th? That's the problem here. We had 2 or 4 more teams. We are going to dilute the product even more. There are already too many games. There are already too many teams. How can we raise the quality of the product? How can we make the teams more competitive? That's my goal. That is my goal as a hockey person. I want to see as many teams as possible that can legitimately win the Stanley Cup, as opposed to as many teams as possible that can make the playoffs. I don't care. The Islanders have made the playoffs 2 years in a row and lost in the first round to Carolina both times. We knew the Islanders weren't going on a run. The Kings have lost to the Oilers in the first round 3 years in a row. Do we really need to see them run it back a 4th time? You know, at a certain point, you reach a saturation of the product, and there are too many games. They are too expensive to go to in person for a lot of people, and you are only making the game less accessible. You put 2 more bad teams in there, you are hurting season ticket holders. You are hurting the quality of the product when regular season games start to matter less. Don't even get me started on the people who are saying, well, if we go to 34 or 36 teams, we can expand the playoff. We don't need more playoff teams. We don't need more playoff teams. We already get 2 to 3 series every year in the first round that are academic. One team smokes the other team because the other team, the lower seed, is not good enough. But because we have 32 teams, we got to have half the field in the playoffs, and it creates a lower quality product. It's frustrating. The NHL has all of this potential. There has never been more people who are looking for things to enjoy. The world has never been more accessible. You have streaming, you have high-speed internet. You can watch the NHL, but instead we're going to go into markets like Atlanta, where we've already failed twice. We might go to Houston. We might do Quebec City. We might do a second Toronto team. Great. That doesn't solve the problem. We are not making more revenue for everyone. We are just splitting the revenue more. It is frustrating beyond belief to see people be so short-sighted. Short-term solutions lead to longer-term problems. The NHL is having growth issues. They need to be doing everything in their power to get this league in front of as many people as possible, so that the demand to watch the National Hockey League is higher, so that the next time we do TV rights, they get closer to MLB, to the NBA. They're never going to sniff the NFL, especially in the United States. The NHL can get close to MLB. The NHL absolutely can get close to MLB in terms of its TV rights if they play their cards right. Unfortunately, we're going to end up with like the Cincinnati Wanderers as a hockey team that the Oilers are going to beat 7-2 because Curtis Lazar is on their second line. But hey, let the rich people make the decisions that impact the rest of us, I guess. Whatever. All right, that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where I'm tired, man. We don't need more teams. There are already too many mediocre and bad teams. Before we get out of here, if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave me a comment. More teams, less teams, too many games. Let me know how you feel about the state of the NHL as far as its parity. And before we get out of here, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. Now for your second listen, go find Locked On NHL, where the local experts keep you updated daily on all the biggest stories ahead of the season. Find Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'll talk to you guys on Monday. Have a safe and fun weekend. See you guys then.